So this is the second lecture on approach to colon biopsy. In the very first lecture, we have seen how to approach a colon biopsy, and that was particularly with emphasis to ulcerative colitis. So today we'll come to the second half of IBD, and that's your Crohn's disease. Now before I go on to Crohn's disease, let me tell you what is the ideal requirement for biopsies in a suspected IBD. This is the recommendation from all over the world, that there should be ideally 5 sites which should be biopsied. 1 from ileum, 1 from rectum, and 3 should be from your colon. That's 1 left colon, 1 right colon, and your transverse colon. So that's the ideal recommendation. And from each of these sites, endoscopist is expected to give us 4 bits. And all of these should ideally again be in separate containers which are labeled. Now, what is the logic behind suggesting such an extensive biopsy? The logic is IBD, particularly your Crohn's disease, as we all know, is a very patchy disease. Patchy as in, we know that Crohn's can involve the entire GIT, starting from your esophagus to your anus, unlike an ulcerative colitis, which is mostly restricted to the large colon. Not only it can involve the entire GIT, it's an extremely patchy disease. So you will have areas which are involved, areas which are not involved, which we call as skip lesions. So keeping in mind this patchiness, these recommendations are given so that your sensitivity of giving a diagnosis increases. So this is mostly to increase the sensitivity of your diagnosis. So that's the biopsy recommendations. Now coming to Crohn's disease per se. Now, Crohn's is a disease which in about say 30 to 40% of the patients, it's the upper GI tract which is the most, or which is the exclusive involved area. So this is which we are not going to discuss today because our focus is colon biopsy. In approximately 10 to 20% of patients, it's the colon which is exclusively involved. In another 30 to 40% of cases, there is what we call as the ileocolonic involvement. So you can see is anywhere between 10 till 60%, that's around, I should say, nearly 1/2 to 2/3 of patients are the one who will come with ileocolonic manifestations. So that's the reason when we have these extensive 5-site biopsies, we are covering both the ileum and the colon right up to the rectum. So these are the cohort of patients, that is 2/3 of patients who have these ileocolonic manifestations are those whose biopsies you are likely to get. Now, Crohn's is again, as I said, because of the patchiness of the disease, giving a definitive diagnosis of Crohn's, particularly in the first biopsy, is a Herculean task. And this is even more so for the Asian pathologist, because we know that the big elephant in the room, TB, has a lot of histological features which overlaps with Crohn's. So we'll take up how to arrive at a reasonably confident diagnosis of Crohn's, and of course how to distinguish from tuberculosis. So as I told you in the beginning, Crohn's is an extremely patchy disease. Now this patchiness of the disease is both in terms of its chronicity as well as in terms of its activity. Which means you will have areas, mucosal bits, where the architecture is absolutely normal. And then you will have mucosal bits where they will have all those features like basal plasmacytosis, crypt atrophy, basal plasmacytosis, crypt branching, crypt loss, all of this, panic cell metaplasia. You may find one or all of these. So this is very patchy. Normal areas, abnormal areas. Sometimes within a single site biopsy you can have mucosal bits normal and abnormal. Sometimes the patchiness can be amongst the different sites. So that's the reason why these different biopsies are taken. Activity is again very patchy. You will in the same mucosal fragment, you can see cryptitis, you can see cryptapsis. At the same time, you can see even absolutely normal crypts. So this is the patchiness which is the first clue that you are likely dealing with a Crohn's. Of course, your endoscopist will give you all the information in the world that you need in terms of the endoscopic features. But for pathologists, this patchiness is the first clue. So I'll draw your attention to these images. By the way, these images are all from the internet and from reputed books. They are not my images. So please, I want to make that very clear at the outset. Now you can see this in the single mucosal bed. If you see the architecture, first thing is overtly the architecture doesn't look so bad. But even if you look carefully, you see there is some crowding happening here. Again here it's widely spaced. But if you come here, they look more or less normal. So the architecture is not overtly bad, but at the same time it's not all fine. You have areas where reasonably fine and then areas which are definitely not okay. So this is what I was talking about, the patchiness of the disease. This is the patchiness in the activity. Look at this crypt. Virtually half of the crypt is eaten away by these neutrophils. But then look at these crypts. They look quite viable. This crypt becomes very small and atrophic. So this is what is called the patchiness in terms of the activity. Even in terms of the lamina propria inflammatory content, also there is patchiness. So you will have areas where the inflammation is more pronounced in lamina propria, areas where you tend to see a little more edema and less inflammation. So that is also white patchiness. Then another thing is, if at all you get to see a ulceration in a biopsy mucosal bed given to you, often you will realize that these ulcers tend to be deep and they are fissuring ulcers. This is as opposed to our UC ulcer, the ulcerative colitis ulcers, which were surface ulcers. They are flat ulcers. These tend to be deep, longitudinal and fissuring ulcers. You can see this is this base of the ulcer. This is all your granulation tissue that you have in the base of the ulcer. And if you look at the adjacent viable areas, you will see there is a lot of crypt branching and which has taken place here. So you definitely have this evidence of chronicity in the form of crypt branching. You can see here, and its activity, the severe activity. Ulceration is nothing but the most severe form of activity. So you can see this chronic colitis with activity, which we traditionally keep on harping. Chronic colitis with activity is something that you can see here with the presence of a deep longitudinal fissuring ulcer. So far so good. Now you must be wondering why I haven't yet come to the topic of granuloma in Crohn's, because we keep teaching undergraduates and postgraduates that Crohn's is one entity where you can get granuloma in the colon biopsy or in the biopsy of the intestine. Now first of all, granuloma is seen in only 30 to 50% of the biopsy. That is the first thing. So one half of patients you will not have granuloma at all, and in the remaining one half that you have, you may see a granuloma. Now granuloma interpretation in colon is a little tricky thing. The trickiness is because of the fact that there are different types of granuloma and each have its own significance. I don't know whether you have heard, there's something called cryptolytic granuloma, and that's the image I have focused on the right side. What is this cryptolytic granuloma is, sometimes what happens, a crypt may rupture. That could rupture because of any reason. You may have mucin accumulation too much and it ruptures. So when this crypt ruptures, the mucin content gets extravasated, and that is very immunogenic. So what it does, the resident macrophages which are there in the lamina propria, it will incite them and that will transform into epithelioid cells and it will try and cover that ruptured crypt. That's what we call as a cryptolytic granuloma in response to a ruptured or a destroyed crypt. If you see such kind of granuloma, cryptolytic granuloma, mind you, it is absolutely non-diagnostic from a pathologist perspective. It does not tell us anything. You can see this in any condition. You can see this in UC, in Crohn's, in malignancies, in TB. Virtually any colonic intestinal disease can have a cryptolytic granuloma. So do not make your diagnosis of Crohn's based on presence of a cryptolytic granuloma. What we are more interested is something which is known as the pericryptal granuloma. So what are these pericryptal granulomas? These pericryptal granulomas are granulomas which are present in the mucosa, that is in the lamina propria, but they are always adjacent to what I call as viable normal crypts. So they are not in relation to any ruptured or destroyed crypt. They are in adjacent to a viable normal crypt. Sometimes these pericryptal granulomas are more readily seen when the biopsy bits are taken from a normal appearing mucosa. That means when an endoscopist, when they biopsy a suspected Crohn's, what they do is they biopsy a visibly abnormal mucosa and they biopsy a visibly normal mucosa also. These pericryptal granulomas are tend to more often be seen in those visibly normal mucosal bit that we have. These pericryptal mucosal granulomas are the ones which are more suggestive of Crohn's. So that's the kind of granuloma that we look for, not the one that I showed you earlier, which is absolutely non-diagnostic from our perspective. Now, sometimes this pericryptal granuloma can be really very small, what we call as a microgranuloma. So what is microgranuloma? The definition is when it's less than 100 micrometer in size, that's when we call this microgranuloma. So sometimes they can be just a collection of aggregates of few epithelial histiocytes forming a microgranuloma. Alongside, you can see these viable normal crypts. You need to really tune your eyes to recognize these small granulomas, because even presence of these microgranulomas are also quite suggestive of Crohn's in an appropriate clinical endoscopic context. Now look at this image on the left side. You can see that this is a submucosa, right? This is a mucosa, this is a submucosa, and you can see there is a large granuloma in the submucosa. These are large, that is more than 200 micron. They are well formed, they are confluent, they have this nice cuffing of lymphocytes. These kind of granulomas, which are more in the submucosa, which are large, well defined, confluent with lymphocytic cuffing, they are the ones which tend to be more suggestive of tuberculosis. So my dear friends, granuloma in an Asian context, TB is something that we can never be sure about, except that there are certain morphological clues by which we can give a distinction. The distinction being, Crohn's granuloma are more mucosal granulomas alongside normal appearing crypts. They tend to be small, they tend to be ill-defined, and of course they are non-necrotizing usually. The TB granulomas, on the other hand, tend to be more submucosa centric. They are large, well-defined, confluent. They tend to have a nice lymphocytic cuffing. And of course, if you do have a caseous necrosis, that makes life even more easier, because widespread caseous necrosis is of course more that we see tuberculosis. So these are subtle differences in the granuloma morphology that can help us in distinguishing our eternal problem, that's TB versus Crohn's. Now the question is, why so much harping on the morphology of the granuloma, and is it like, I would say, mutually exclusive, that is mucosal granuloma always Crohn's and a submucosal granuloma always TB? No, that's not the case. You may have mucosal granulomas in TB, you may have submucosal granulomas in Crohn's, but this is by and large the observation is that submucosa centric large well defined granulomas are more of TB. Mucosal small ill defined granulomas, pericryptal in location, tend to be more often Crohn's. Of course, you need to have your endoscopic input, which is of very much utility when it comes to the distinction. How does AFB stain is of not much help, because intestinal tuberculosis are inherently paucibacillary. Your positive stain would be just about, if you do an AFB stain, you would be probably 3 to 35%, depending upon which study you quote, would be your positivity rate. Even if you do a culture for tubercular bacilli, you may push up the sensitivity at best to 50%. So 1/2 of patients would still not show you evidence of a real bacilli in terms of stain or culture. And that's the reason why knowing the morphological distinction becomes so much more important. Now, I think I have completed the histological features from a practical point of view for both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. But your report should not end here. There are important negative findings, or I should say there are important other features we should actively look for, and if not present, one should always give a negative report. The first of that is viral inclusion. The other is dysplasia / adenocarcinoma. Particularly here, problematic is the CMV, and to a lesser extent your herpes virus. Now see, these CMV infections are quite ubiquitous. All of us might have the infection, but we don't have the disease because it's mostly in the latent form. What happens in this IBD is, these patients are on long-term steroid. So they have what is called as immunosuppression. And because of this immunosuppression, they tend to have what is known as a CMV reactivation. And once this happens, it's a double-edged sword. You have a CMV reactivation itself make the disease process worsen. And the treatment of the IBD is counterintuitive to management of CMV, because CMV has happened because of immunosuppression. And to manage IBD, you need immunosuppression. So to balance that is a real problem. So that's a reason why this thing has to be recognized, because you need to convey that information to your patient, to your clinician, that look, your patient may be too much immunosuppressed and he is having this CMV reactivation, which might make the disease process worsen further. These are more common in steroid refractory than steroid sensitive. So CMV inclusions is something that we should Actively look for, and if not present, do mention that there is no evidence of viral occlusion. Just a quick thing, I would suggest all of you go back and read CMV morphology, but just to show here, the easiest way to look for CMV is what I call as location guided screening. Look in the ulcerated area. In the ulcerated areas, look in the granulation tissue. The likelihood is that you are more likely to find the CMV inclusions in the endothelial cells which are present in the granulation tissue. That's where they are maximum. They can be present in epithelial cell or macrophages, but they tend to be present more often in the endothelial cell. Look at these nuclei. They will stand out. The CMV infected nuclei will stand out even at 10x because of this huge megalic nuclei that you have and this presence of this smudgy eosinophilic to basophilic inclusion that you have inside the nuclei. Textbook will say that there are biphasic inclusion, the inclusions present in cytoplasm as well, but they are much more difficult to see in HND. So that's why you see the CMV inclusions maximum. When in doubt, some institutions even resort to IHC. Now the second elephant here is the dysplasia. Now depending upon again what study you see, they say the incidence of dysplasia to adenocarcinoma in a patient of IBD is roughly somewhere around 2%. That's the thing. And with every decade that a patient has IBD, the risk continues to increase by 1%. So therefore, in a biopsy given to you, one must look for dysplasia as well, because that's the best indicator that this patient may land up in adenocarcinoma. So look at this. Sometime to begin with, the dysplasia can be very patchy. So the endoscopist may not know that there is dysplasia, because for him there is no initially the lesion may be flat. So endoscopist will not know there is a dysplasia. You may be the first one to pick up. And look at here, you have this absolutely normal crypts which are all marked in blue arrows, and look at the crypts which are marked with the black arrows. The first thing that strikes you is that these crypts tend to be much more darker. That is, they are much more mucodepleted compared to these normal crypts. And if you see the nuclei which are lining the crypt epithelium, they will have all the features that you typically read in low-grade dysplasia. That is, nuclear elongation, stratification, they will have hyperchromasia. As you go to higher grade dysplasia, you will have nucleoli, you will have more loss of polarity, nuclei reaching up to the luminal surface. So all this traditional teaching that we have about low grade dysplasia and high grade dysplasia, they all are applicable here, except for the fact that to begin with, the dysplastic crypts or the glands will be very patchy, and you really need to look carefully to pick up dysplasia even at this stage. By the way, this is an example of a palliatic metaplasia. Sorry, not palliatic. This is Panna-cell metaplasia that you have here, which is an indicator of very long-standing chronic disease. So this is what a high-grade dysplasia. You can see the loss of polarity, the nuclear hyperchromasia, the presence of mitosis, even up to the luminal surface. Everything is much more pronounced. So low-grade dysplasia, high-grade dysplasia, you must be able to distinguish in them. Low-grade dysplasia and a high-grade. So even the surface here is, you can see, is dysplastic. So when it comes to the dysplasia, you have what is called as four category or four tier reporting, and that's what was given by Vienna classification. One is called negative for dysplasia, or you can also call it non-dysplastic mucosa. Then something called as indefinite for dysplasia. That means you're not so sure whether there is a dysplasia or not. Then of course you have a low grade dysplasia and a high grade dysplasia.
18.5.
Now the problem with this the problem is these two. There's a lot of inter-observer variation in indefinite versus low grade. This is not a problem. Most pathologists can easily recognize. This is also not a problem. Problem is here. When to call is indefinite. The dictum is when you have a lot of inflamed mucosa, the activity is very high, and you are seeing some of the crypts which are showing you nucleomegaly, nucleoli, likely they are regeneration induced ATP. The crypts which have damage, they are regenerating. That's the reason they are having this nucleoli and they are looking a little mucodepleted at angle. So in the setting of an inflamed mucosa, very inflamed mucosa, if you have few crypts showing those features, better to stick to indefinite dysplasia. But if you have a reasonably quiet mucosa, not very active, and you have those features which I pointed out beforehand, better to stick to a low grade. So that's very subjective based on your exposure and experience, but by and large that's what we do. So I just have few templates of report. This is the way that I report in my lab. See, I told you most of the clinicians, they will already, most of them will usually tell me that they have biopsied with the clinical indication of ulcerative colitis, and In my lab, I don't get those 5-side biopsies. I usually get a single-side biopsy. And of course, you should always count, at least make an attempt to count the number of colonic mucosal bits. And when writing a report, always write the features indicating chronicity first. Always. Because that's what is the mandatory criteria for IBD. So all the chronicity features are first highlighted, followed by the features indicating your activity, like your cryptitis, cryptapsis, mucosal erosion, ulceration, which comes later. And as I told you, these are the negative findings. If you don't see them, do mention that you haven't seen any viral inclusion dysplasia or adenocarcinomas. So that's how I report chronic colitis with activity, which is consistent with an ulcerative colitis in active phase, but only if it conjunction with appropriate clinical and endoscopic finding. Now coming to this part, there are numerous grading systems for ulcerative colitis. There are endoscopic systems, there are histological systems. Some institutes prefer them, some say no, they are not required. The only purpose that these grading systems have is they tend to grade the disease activity. So they become important when you get subsequent follow-up biopsies when the patient is in clinical remission to assess whether the patient is also in histological remission or not. So that's the only utility. So I tend to use this GBOS score for histological grading of the disease activity. I would urge you to look it up further. This is another example where I had this biopsy, where again the DD, the clinical DD was ulcerative colitis, but they were also, the picture was not very diagnostic in endoscopy, so they had a DD of infective colitis. So I had a biopsy fragments where the architecture was fine. There was nothing wrong. There was no basal plasmacytosis, crypt branching, cryptotrophy, nothing of that sort. But all those activity features were there. You did have cryptitis, cryptapsis, you did have mucosal ulceration, but they tended to be focal. They were not discontinuous, they were focal, they were patchy. So the diagnosis here in this case is focal active colitis. Now what does it mean? Focal active colitis means there is no chronicity. So I cannot label this as chronic colitis. So what do I tell the clinician? What this is? See, active colitis is something which is of course most commonly seen in infectious colitis, but there are certain circumstances even in IBD where you may not have the chronic colitis, like someone who has get partially treated or someone who have undergone a remission, or in other conditions like drug-induced colitis, ischemic colitis. So these are all the conditions where you may get a focal active colitis. If you have to repeat a biopsy, suppose a clinician says, no, I'm very much suspicious that this could be an IBD and I need to repeat the biopsy. It's your duty to tell him or her that kindly repeat after 4 to 6 weeks, because that's the minimum time it requires for the features of chronicity to be established. So there are instances if the biopsy has been taken at a very early stage of ulcerative colitis or a patient who have got some partial treatment, you may not see the chronic features. In that case, all you will see is a patchy active disease. So in that case, if the clinical indication persists or the clinical suspicion persists, you should recommend a repeat, but after 4 to 6 weeks. Thank you very much.